Hi everyone, and welcome to my channel, Single Divorced Mama, where I tell stories about tragic and eerie romances. Today, I felt it was fitting to travel back in time to Salem, Massachusetts, June 10th, 1692. At the center of it all is a woman named Bridget Bishop, the first woman hanged during what became known as the Salem witch trials. Now, before we get to Bridget, we have to understand the world she lived in. Salem in 1692 was nothing like the tourist town that celebrates witches today. Back then, nobody was selling broomsticks or velvet cloaks. The people of Salem feared witches. They believed they were real, dangerous, and working directly for the devil. The town had already been founded by Puritans, a strict religious group from England. The Puritans left their homeland in the early 1600s because they thought the Church of England had become too worldly. They wanted to build what they called a city upon a hill, a holy community that would serve as an example of purity and obedience to God. They crossed the Atlantic in cramped wooden ships, bringing little more than their tools, their Bibles, and an unshaken belief that every hardship was a test from God. When I say they were carving small towns out of the New England wilderness, I mean that literally. They were settlers clearing dense forests, building houses from raw timber, and trying to survive brutal winters surrounded by wolves, storms, and uncertainty. To them, the world was divided between God and Satan. Anything that went wrong, a sick cow, a stillborn child, a cold snap that ruined the crops, could be blamed on the devil's influence. By the late 1600s, Salem was a hard, suspicious little place. People worked from sunrise to sunset just to survive. Most lived in one-room homes with smoky fireplaces, dirt floors, and almost no privacy. Church wasn't just a Sunday obligation, it was law. Attendance was mandatory, and sermons lasted for hours. There were two Salems, Salem Town near the harbor where trade and wealth flowed, and Salem Village, poorer and more isolated. That split bred jealousy. The farmers resented the merchants, and the merchants looked down on the farmers. The colony was also scarred by King Philip's War, fought from 1675 to 1678 between English settlers and the indigenous tribes. It was one of the most deadliest conflicts per capita in American history. Dozens of Massachusetts towns were burned, and survivors carried that trauma for decades. Then came outbreaks of smallpox and tuberculosis. Children died young, and people began to see disease as a punishment. Fear became part of daily life. By 1692, the people of Salem were exhausted, physically, spiritually, and emotionally. And in a world where fear needs a face, they began to find one. Bridget Magnus was born in England around 1632, most likely in Norwich. She grew up during England's civil turmoil and eventually crossed the ocean, probably in search of the stability that her home country couldn't offer. She arrived in Massachusetts sometime before 1660 and soon married Samuel Wesselby. The couple had at least 2 children before Samuel's death 6 years later. Widowed young, Bridget remarried in 1666 to Thomas Oliver, a sawyer who also made barrels. Together they ran what was known as an ordinary, a small tavern where travelers would stop for ale and a meal. Running a tavern gave Bridget a rare bit of independence. She met people, handled money, and made her own choices. But in Puritan society, that kind of freedom came at a cost. Neighbors complained that she dressed too brightly. Red ribbons instead of black, silk instead of wool. They whispered that her laughter was unladylike and her tavern too lively. Her marriage to Thomas was rocky. The couple quarreled publicly, and both were brought before the court more than once for fighting and abusive words. The records don't say much, but they paint the picture of a woman who refused to be quiet. When Thomas died in 1679, rumors started almost immediately that Bridget had bewitched him to death. No evidence, no witnesses, just gossip. 8 years later, she married for a third time to Edward Bishop, another sawyer who owned property near Salem Village. Edward was also accused of witchcraft during the trials but was later released. Men were sometimes accused, but they weren't the ones who died. Hanging was reserved for women who were outspoken, widowed, or different. By 1692, Salem was ready to explode. Disputes over property lines dragged neighbors to court. Ministers argued over whether salvation came through faith or good deeds. Famine threatened. The harvest had failed the previous year, and grain was rotting in damp storage barns. At the same time, fear of the frontier lingered. News of native raids up north, French conflicts, and bandits traveling the coastal roads. The people were looking for a reason, a cause, an enemy. They found one that fit perfectly into their theology: witches. In January 1692, something strange happened inside the parsonage of Reverend Samuel Parris. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty Parris, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began having violent fits, screaming, contorting, throwing things, even crawling under furniture. The local doctor couldn't explain it. There was no medicine for fear, so he blamed witchcraft. Soon, other girls began showing the same symptoms: Ann Putnam Jr., Elizabeth Hubbard, and a few others. Together, they became known as the Afflicted Girls, and their word carried power. When pressed to name who was tormenting them, they began pointing fingers, and one of the first names they spoke was Bridget Bishop. Bridget was about 60 years old when constables came for her. She denied everything, insisting, "I am innocent. I know nothing of it. I am as innocent as the child unborn." But innocence didn't matter. At her interrogation, the afflicted girls screamed and collapsed whenever she looked at them. The magistrates, John Hawthorne and Jonathan Corwin, took that as proof. Neighbors testified that she had bewitched their pigs, that their mysterious deaths followed her arguments that she owned small dolls with pins in them, what we'd call pin cushions, but to Puritans they were poppets, tools of sorcery. The court system at the time allowed spectral evidence, testimony claiming someone's spirit had harmed another person, even if the accused was nowhere near them. In that kind of system, no one stood a chance. Her trial was held on June 2nd, 1692, before a new special court created just to handle witchcraft cases. No lawyer defended her. No witnesses spoke for her. She stood alone as the girls performed their fits, clutching their throats and falling to the floor. She kept denying the charges, saying over and over that she knew nothing of witchcraft. But in Salem that spring, reason had already lost. The jury found her guilty. She was sentenced to death by hanging. So, on June 10th, 1692, Bridget Bishop was led to Proctor's Ledge, a rocky hill just outside of town. She wore the same colorful clothing that had made her stand out in life: bright ribbons, silk trim, a touch of defiance in a world that demanded humility. Witnesses said she prayed quietly until the end. When the rope tightened, the crowd fell silent. Bridget Bishop was the first to die in the Salem witch hysteria. 18 more women would follow, and one man, Giles Corey, would be pressed to death with stones for refusing to plead. But no man was ever hanged. Every woman who swung from those gallows had one thing in common: she was different. In the years that followed, Salem tried to forget what it had done. Some of the accusers apologized. The courts admitted mistakes, and in 1711, the colony officially cleared Bridget Bishop's name. Today, Salem embraces what it once feared. There are witch museums, candle shops, and ghost tours that celebrate the very thing those Puritans tried to destroy. It's ironic, really. The town that once hanged women for being witches now celebrates them. Hopefully not to romanticize it, but to remember the injustice and to honor those who were wronged. When I think about Bridget Bishop, a woman who ran her own business, who wore what she pleased, and who refused to be silenced, I think she would have thrived in our world. Because today, women like Bridget aren't dragged to the gallows for standing out. We build our own platforms, our own businesses, and our own voices. We speak and we're heard. So maybe that's her legacy. Not the rope, not the fear, but the fact that centuries later, the same kind of woman she once was now gets to tell her story out loud. As for Bridget's children, that part of her story is mostly lost to time. Finding factual records from the 1600s is difficult, especially when it comes to women and children. They were rarely documented unless tied to land, wealth, or scandal, and Bridget's family didn't fall into those categories. Her name only appears in the records later, once she became part of a public trial. That's the tragic part. Most of what we know about her comes from accusations, not from her real life. What little we know suggests she likely had 2 children from her first marriage, but their names and what became of them were never confirmed. It's one of those gaps in history that reminds us how easily ordinary lives, especially those of women, disappeared from the record.